All right, guys. So we are going to get going on this lecture. If you guys remember, we're doing World War One. That's where we left off lecture-wise. So I'm going to recap just a little bit and then go forward. I'm not going to do the whole entire thing today because that would be way too much. All right. So World War One, I've told you guys time and time again that every new war is fought with the old type of strategy, but new weapons and new strategies come about. And so at the beginning of every war, there's a huge deficit as far as when those new technologies get used up against the old tactics, and that's never a good matchup. All right. But usually one side is much better prepared than the other. And since Germany was really driving this literally through Belgium and trying to get to France before Russia could mobilize, because Russia, remember, is like a sleeping giant, then this puts Germany on the advantage side at the very beginning of the war. All right, so we've got new kinds of machine guns, right? It's called the Maxim gun. It's automatic rifle. It's got that circular kind of barrel. That's what that little gray arrow is pointing at. We've got trench warfare. So you got all these really big trenches dug miles and miles and miles, hundreds of miles, dug all throughout Europe. And so that's how you kind of get around. Literally, you could go through these trenches and get from point A to point B. They were often zigzagged because that way, if there was some kind of explosion that would happen, the zigzag would kind of block some of the blast, and you could kind of go around the corner. So think like a Z, right? And so that created a lot more trench, like as far as length goes, but it actually saved lots of people's lives. Okay. So if we're looking at this, you guys can hopefully see what I'm talking about. There's some straightaways, but then they would cut across, and so there'd be zigzags and that kind of thing. You guys have access to this. Why can't I think today of this PowerPoint? So you guys can watch all of the videos and everything else. I'm not going to play them right now because that would just take, again, too long. So you guys can go in and click on them as much as you like. Okay, so we've got all kinds of planes being used in World War One. A lot of recon that's going to happen. This is where we start to get like Snoopy and the Red Baron. The Red Baron was a real dude. You got some dog fights. That's what they would call these airplanes fighting each other in the sky. They got open cockpit, not as sophisticated as you would see obviously today or in World War II, but we start to see some kind of aerial fighting that's going on. Okay, we've got barbed wire, a very simple thing that actually is invented in America to keep cattle in, but it becomes devastating for troops because they get tangled in it and they just get literally mowed down. So we've got then what we call no man's land, right? And so this is the land between where all the trenches are, and you got to try and get from your trench to the enemy's trench, and that's that no man's land. Okay, it's mud. It's like all of the weaponry cuts down literally trees, and what used to be forests just disappear. Okay, then we've got our frontline trenches. That's obviously in the very beginning, and then you've got your supporting trench that where people can kind of come and go in between, and then your very back, your reserve trench. They would try, and as the war starts going on, we start to see something that they term battle fatigue, which is what we would call PTSD today. And when that would happen, you try and cycle out your soldiers so they wouldn't spend too much time at the front lines. Okay, and then all of this is backed up by your artillery in the way back. Giant, I mean, talking giant types of artillery. So, all of these things, I would not want to go anywhere on there at all. It's just absolutely devastating. All right, so yay, trench foot. It's wet, it's gross, and if you don't keep your feet dry, then they're going to turn into this, which is disgusting. But this is like one of the minor things you kind of had to deal with. But if you guys can see in this bottom corner over here, you've got that, like when it rains and it's mud and it's gross and you're not getting out to go to the bathroom anywhere. So all of that is what you're walking around in. Okay. Also, we've got tons of rats that run through all these trenches, and so there actually would be people who would come in and try and catch the rats. Sometimes they would actually breed rats because they would get paid by the rat, and so they would breed their own, and they would end up with higher counts than if they just went in the trenches and caught them. Uh, so that's obviously, I guess, good business sense, but also, I wouldn't again want to be anywhere near there, let alone like live in it or sleep in it, and definitely not eat it. Okay. I'm again, you can see Life in a Trench, History Channel, so you guys can watch that whenever you like. Okay. More weapons, poisonous gas. So this is where we start to see the use of what's called especially mustard gas. Um, Chlorine gas, and the gas would just it's like a fog, it would just kind of roll out across the like the battlefield, and because it was like heavier than regular air, because obviously it's got all these different chemical components in it, you could just see it rolling across the battlefield, and there's nothing you could do to necessarily get away from it, because if you got up out of it, then you would be shot with the opposing side's weapons. um, so we start to see gas masks being used. All kinds of people get injured, get killed. Not a good situation at all. Just, I mean, obviously you're going to suffocate to death. Just like really horrible stuff. Okay. Then we also have tanks. Um, this is where, once the war's been going on for quite a while, tanks get developed. They can go over some of this terrain, and you can be inside of one and not get, killed right away. So once both sides are literally dug into the trenches and you get the phrase dug in, these tanks would come through and kind of kickstart the battle again and kind of get things going, because both sides just before that were just a stalemate for so long. All right, this lovely guy, Fritz Haber, father of chemical warfare. Lovely looking guy right there, right? So he is German. He's of Jewish descent. And he actually gets awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for some of his developments in coming up with like fertilizer and being able to, make yields and farms better. So that's good, right? But then he goes on and he uses that thing he developed, ammonia, and turns it into chlorine gas. And then he uses it on the battlefields. Uh, he ends up being forced to leave Germany during the lead up to World War II, because, he's Jewish. But this chemical compound is what gets used, ironically, in the final solution where we're gassing millions of Jews in different gas chambers and things, right? So all around lovely guy. Um, During World War One, he was always testing and trying to figure out how to make his weapons better. Scientists did not like what he was all about. They thought that the chemical warfare not really great. His wife actually ended up committing suicide because she's like, I don't like this. This is horrible for people. Obviously, you're killing them. And she just was so distraught over it, she ended up committing suicide. The next morning, the dude gets up, his wife is dead, and he's just like, all right, I guess I'm going to go back to work. Gets up and leaves, right? He eventually dies kind of alone, depressed, and nobody in the community, in the scientific community, likes what he's all about. I don't like what he's all about. So that's kind of Fritz Haber, kind of interesting side note on that. Okay, so other types of new weapons. I've already kind of talked about airplanes. You guys can see the dogfight in the black and white picture, where they're kind of crashing into each other. Submarines, what we call U-boats. U-boats stand for undersea boats. It's a submarine, basically. Okay, so you can't really pick up survivors in a U-boat. It's kind of cramped and packed, but they could ram other boats. They could attack other boats. And so a lot of the devastation that happens in the water especially when we get to Lusitania here in a minute, that's going to be all U-boat stuff. Okay, and it changes kind of the rules of warfare because, again, new type of technology. Okay. All right, so for all my visual people, if you want to look at how deadly the First World War was and why it made such a big impact and how no one wanted to go through another world war, which sets the ground for World War II, you've got this is the percentage of your entire country that becomes a statistic or some kind of casualty, right? A casualty, either wounded or killed. Check out Russia in my green thing here. 76% of that country in some way is a casualty of World War One. France, 73%. Poor Austria-Hungary, where this whole thing kind of starts, 90%, right? So the United States, we're very small. We definitely still felt an impact, but we're only 8%. Part of that's because we get into the war during the last 2 years. We're not in it for the whole time, on top of which it's obviously not being fought on our soil. So that accounts for a great deal of why our percentage is so small. Okay. If we look at the military deaths, right? So people who are actually fighting and in the military, France, a quarter of their entire military is dead. British Empire, 16%. Russian Empire, 30% of their entire military. So obviously, if I look at 30% of the military and 76% of their entire country, that's a little different there. Okay. That's what they're going to tell you, that a lot of civilians in Russia get killed. So then if I look at it, break it down by the Allied and the Central Powers, allies have far more deaths than the Central Powers do. Okay. And that, again, accounts for some of it being on the offensive versus being defensive, right? But all around, everybody really suffers horribly. All these countries, it's not good. All right. So United States, we try and be neutral. We don't get involved into World War I for quite a while. So it's going to benefit us if we stay out of it. And for 100 years, really, the United States has really not been super involved in major European affairs. We've kind of been doing our own thing. So we're economically and culturally, we felt closer to the Allies. Britain, obviously, we speak the same language. A lot of our people from America are coming from English-speaking areas in Europe. German, they invaded Belgium, Belgium's neutrality, and that really kind of shocked Americans. Like, I can't believe you would do that. Belgium made it very clear they didn't want to be involved in this, and he just literally walked right in and took over that country. I'm going to talk about there's a secret telegram from Germany to Mexico. It's called the Zimmerman telegram. And what happens is basically the Brits intercept this telegram because there's this thing called the transatlantic cable, a giant cable that lays on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And you can send telegrams between really all over the world through this big cable. So Britain had decoded this message that Germany had sent to Mexico. Basically, Germany's all like, check it out, Mexico. If you come into the war on our side, then we're going to let you get back part of Texas and Arizona and that on all the West that America got from you. We're going to give it back to you if you come into World War I on our side. And of course, once this all happens, then the United States finds out. Wilson kind of holds this in his pocket because at first Congress did not want to declare war and go to war. He holds it for like a week and then he busts it out, and it's like his ace in the hole. Once America finds out about the Zimmerman telegram, they lose their minds and they're all like, no, we can go to war now. Okay. We've also got something called unrestricted submarine warfare, and Wilson had worked really hard to try and get Germany to not attack passenger ships like Lusitania and the Sussex, But Germany's like, if you're carrying any kind of munitions, and a lot of passenger ships would carry passengers, but they'd also kind of have a secret side stash of things to help the other side that would go from America to Britain, for instance. And Germany knows this and is like, that's not cool. We're going to bomb you. We're going to attack that ship if we think that there's some kind of military aid on it. So Wilson kind of works with Germany for a diplomatic angle, saying, "Hey, you need to, before you're going to, blow us out of the sky or out of the ocean, you need to tell us and warn us so that we have the chance to kind of surrender." And so Germany says, "All right, we'll do that, but you better tell your friends Britain that they need to not be attacking us either." So it's got to kind of go all the way around. All right. So there's kind of like a real tense series of events that are going on, and we're not quite in the war yet. But all of these things start happening, and it kind of starts to build and build and build. All right. So we got closer ties with the Allies. This is what Germany does. The Zimmerman Note happens, and then there's something called the Freedom of the Seas, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in depth. All right. So freedom of the seas, unrestricted submarine warfare. So the British, one thing that happens all the time in wars is a blockade. So if you look over here where this little red arch is, so Britain takes their ships and they line them up right where Germany has access to the ocean, and they block that port so they can't get ships coming in and out. So you're blocking their supply of all things that come on ships. It's a tactic that gets used over and over and over again all around the world. Okay. So this really hits Germany hard. They can't get a lot of things like medical supplies and foods. So, and anybody who's sailing all around Britain and Germany, there's tons of U-boats and lots of back and forth happening between these two countries. Okay. So, as I mentioned, we've got the sinking of the Lusitania. So, Lusitania gets sunk. It's sunk off the coast of Ireland. Over 1,200 passengers are killed. They drown, and 128 of those are Americans. Now, the Lusitania absolutely had some cargo that was military cargo, and that's what Germany said. Well, we told you guys if there was any kind of military cargo on any of these passenger liners, then that you weren't really a passenger liner anymore. You were helping the war effort. We were going to sink you. So we told you that was going to happen. But this still really gets a lot of people kind of fired up, especially a lot of Irish Americans, because that's where a lot of these people were coming from and going to. All right. So you could rescue a lot of the passengers after the sinking of the ship. And that was like, all right, that's cool. Fine, we're going to blow you up because you got military stuff on there, but we're going to save all the passengers. But U-boats were so small that you couldn't do that. So they were all left to drown. Yay. Okay, so the Sussex. This is another ship, and Germany says, "All right, fine, all right, cool," because Germany's trying not to make America mad. They don't want America to come in on this, so they're really willing to work with Wilson on these diplomatic angles so that they don't get America pulled into this war. So Germany says, "All right, we won't blow up passenger ships, only ships carrying weapons, and we have to save the passengers." And this is where Wilson says, like, "Okay, you got to give us a chance to kind of say, yeah, we've got stuff on here. We're going to surrender." Well, when the sinking of the Lusitania and the Sussex happened, Wilson threatens Germany with breaking diplomatic relations because they did not offer the Lusitania that chance. None of these passengers were saved. And now Germany is really gonna be real worried that America's kind of come in on this. So they're like, okay. We'll follow the Sussex Pledge. All right. Well, we won't do this anymore. But then Germany announces that they're going to sink all ships, violating this freedom of the seas where passenger ships could kind of go back and forth. And in March of 1917, they sink 5 unarmed merchant ships. So you guys can see that in this lovely, disturbing propaganda piece over here, only one word on there. But however, it's very clear that this woman and her child are drowning. They are not soldiers in any way, shape, or form. So they are obviously victims. It's very, you get a very visceral and emotional response to it, right? So things like this get Americans fired up. So a little bit of a timeline, kind of recapping some things here, okay? So way back in 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. Lusitania is sunk by German U-boats. 1916, President Wilson is reelected. And remember, America's really not in this at this point. We're getting kind of fed up and tired with a lot of things that Germany's doing. But we have the Sussex Pledge that says, okay, we're not going to attack these ships anymore that have passengers on them. But then a couple months later, in 1917, in January, Germany says, yeah, okay, forget that. We're just going to blow everything up. And then a little while later, January 19th, so not too long after that unrestricted submarine warfare, Germany sends Mexico that little telegram that's known as the Zimmerman Note that says, hey, check it out. You want some of America back that they took from you? We'll come into the war on Germany's side, Mexico, and we'll make sure that happens. All right. Then this note gets held until the end of March, and then it gets presented to Congress, and this ends up being the kind of straw that breaks the camel's back, and the United States declares war on Germany on April 6th of 1917. Okay, so not everybody was real excited about going to war. A lot of people in the Midwest and the West have a lot of German background in their lives. They were immigrants from Germany at some point, or their ancestors were. You have a lot of Irish and Germans, people who were progressives and socialists who really just didn't want to get involved in any of this stuff in any way, shape, or form, either through cultural ties or their political beliefs. They didn't want to get involved in this. Wilson understands that, remember, we don't declare war until April of 1917. So in June of 1916, Wilson realizes that he's going to have to kind of start to figure out, like, things are escalating and he's going to kind of have to figure this out. So he passes the National Defense Act, and that basically ramps up production of warships and increases our military in the event that we're going to have to go to war. So when we finally do go to war, and if you look on my Instagram, there's a few things that you guys can see that we've got drafts that are happening, and you can see the play on some of the propaganda that gets used in World War I and World War II and how it compares to being used now. A lot of people are kind of reimagining those. We've got the Selective Service Act. So it's a draft. All right. So you basically are going to require any men from the ages of 21 to 31 to serve in the military. Then we have the Espionage Act, which means you basically can't say anything bad about not just America, but the war effort. So you can't criticize Wilson and what he wants to go to war. And we also have the Sedition Act, and that makes it, if you say something disloyal or abusive about the government, then you can be arrested. So this, obviously, all of you should be thinking back to the Alien and Sedition Acts of Adams's administration. And people are not real excited about this. Okay. So basically, your freedom of speech, your First Amendment right, is really being threatened here. Okay. All right. Ignore that because we're not going to do it. I'm going to talk about Schneck, and then we're going to stop for today. All right. So Schneck versus the United States. This is a 1919 case. So Charles Schneck, he was a socialist, right? Which there's a lot of people in the United States during this time period where socialism is kind of on the rise, but another really big group of people who do not like socialism. So he sends out pamphlets. He's saying that the draft is wrong, that the government can't let you in on that kind of stuff. And if you violate that, then you're going to get charged with the Espionage Act. Okay, so Schneck says, check it out. You're clearly violating my First Amendment right. And the Supreme Court rules there are limits to that freedom of speech. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's the head justice at the time, says that if there's a clear and present danger that when you say something, you're creating a clear and present danger, that is where the line is, that you're not allowed to do that. Okay. Um, but so Schneck he doesn't win his case. This is where you get the term, you can't throw or say fire in a crowded theater. That's actually illegal. That's creating a clear and present danger. Okay. And so he says, quote, clear and present danger that will bring about evils that Congress has the right to prevent, end quote. So that's where your limit is. However, the justice also realizes that, this ruling is going to have a big impact and we can't just overturn everything. So he says, quote, the principle of free thought, not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate, end quote. So that little quotation that Oliver Wendell Holmes says kind of turns around and makes this a landmark case for a lot of media and press. So basically it's saying that last quote I said, yeah, if you agree with me, that's fine. I'm not going to obviously have a problem with what you say, but the First Amendment also protects the freedom for those people who have thoughts that we hate. So people, for me, like Nazis, hate speech, racism, all that kind of stuff. You can say all those hateful things. I vehemently disagree with them, but you're allowed to say them under the First Amendment, right? So that's where this kind of becomes a big thing. But in the short term, it is a win for the U.S. government. Schneck kind of gets screwed here. And kind of in the background of all of this, Wilson is not really like this great guy when it comes to, he's a very nativist president. He is very racist. This becomes more and more evident. A lot of you guys have mentioned this in some of your guys' note cards and things, that he just sits like out there, and that's just how it is. All right, I'm gonna pause it here, and if you want, you guys can watch this, right? So that clear and present danger. SCOTUS is Supreme Court of the United States, of course. This gets revisited in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, but this one is really good. It's also in your guys' vocab video, so you guys can watch that. All right. So